Hello viewers, today we are going to deal with the literary technique of satire. We look at examples of satire a lot of times in our everyday life. A lot of jokes that we crack are full of satire. The objective of this lesson is to study the mode of literary satire, its techniques and types. Summary. Satire is the use of wit and humor in order to offer a criticism of society or an individual. It is often used by writers to expose a society's hypocrisies, follies and errors, and usually it functions indirectly so that it requires some interpretation before we can exactly see what is being criticized. By exposing social hypocrisies, satire points to the flaws in our society so that we can improve upon them. Satire is the exposing of human follies so that these can be laughed at. It includes expressions of ridicule, mockery and scorn. Irony, parody, sarcasm, lampooning and caricaturing are forms of satire in literature and the visual arts. In the 20th century, the best known examples of satire are the cartoons we see in newspapers every day. R.K. Lakshman's cartoons make us laugh at our politicians, businessmen, cricketers and film stars, but essentially through these we laugh at India itself. In contemporary newspapers, we see Scott Adams' Dilbert cartoons that mock the cubicle dwellers and corporate officers of the present day. Satires are very old forms in poetry and can be traced back to the Greeks and Romans in Western literature. Horace, Juvenal, Martial are well known satirists from the ancient times. The satiric form flourished in England in the late 17th and early 18th century, often called the neoclassical age or the age of Pope. Poets like Alexander Pope, Jonathan Swift and John Dryden made fun of royalty, upper classes, dress habits, wars and politicians in their poetry. Novelists like Oliver Goldsmith and Henry Fielding used satire. Satire serves the purpose of exposing the follies of society so that they can be laughed at. In the 20th century, we have the fiction of George Orwell and the poetry of W.H. Auden as examples of satiric literature. The aim of satire is primarily the improvement of any society by identifying its flaws. The poet or writer does not directly attack the flaws. Rather, like cartoonists and comedians, we are given situations and characters where by laughing at them, we are also made aware that we are laughing at our society which produced such situations and characters. Humor thus becomes a mode of laughing at others, but also at ourselves in satire. Satire must therefore always be seen as critique. For example, Swift's description of a city shower shows how politicians build solidarities when they choose to for their own convenience. Political differences are ignored and their alliances or disagreements are not based on any clear principle or belief, but just convenience. Swift does this by showing politicians ignoring their political differences during a rain and running to find shelter. Triumphant Tories and desponding Whigs forget their feuds and join to save their wigs. This is a critique of political alliances and politicians, whether conservatives or radicals, Politicians are only concerned with themselves and nothing more. The image makes us laugh, and this is exactly what satire sets out to do. For humor or laughter is satire's greatest and most effective mode of critique. In simple terms, parody is the imitation of another work or text. Parody works to mock the original or prior text and therefore is a form of satire. Parody converts serious matter of the earlier text into something ridiculous. It takes serious themes like war, death or morality and converts them into comic themes. Absurdity emerges when we recognize that the serious subject matter has been converted into something comic. Parody also involves imitation of the style and tone of the original. Parodies actually, even when they are mocking the previous or original text, show remarkable respect for the original. In literary history, one of the most famous parodies is that of Henry Fielding. His Shamela was a parody of Samuel Richardson's Pamela. Pamela was Richardson's attempt at a moral tale where the woman's virtue is under threat. Dramatic, emotional, serious and very earnest, Richardson's novel was intent on creating the image of a virtuous woman. Pamela is the virtuous girl perpetually under threat of losing her chastity to the wicked Squire Booby, her employer. When Fielding rewrites this story satirically, he portrays Shamela not as a virtuous and innocent girl, but as a scheming, lascivious and wicked woman who seeks to seduce her employer so that she can marry him and become the mistress of a large property. The parody here works to reveal Richardson's one-sided portrait of class tensions, sexuality and gender relations. Fielding, who found Richardson's work pompous and self-righteous, was examining the entire theme of seduction, virtue and property from an entirely different angle. Jane Austen, amused by the seriousness of Gothic fiction, parodied it in her work Northanger Abbey, a parody of Thomas Love Peacock's Nightmare Abbey. The change of context also contributes to the sense of the parodic. This is not always for purposes of satire. Thus, when T.S. Eliot takes Dante's great poem The Inferno for his The Waste Land, he does not parody it for purposes of satire. Today, many classics are parodied. Spike Milligan's rewriting of works such as Frankenstein and Treasure Island calls upon us to examine the conventions of so-called great literature. More recently, Jane Austen's novels have been parodied in works like Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. Most parodies closely follow the style and tone of the original, and substituting one or two words manage to convey satiric effect. Caricature, which we best know in cartoons and comics, works with two main modes: exaggeration and distortion. Specific features of persons, characters and situations are exaggerated or distorted for comic effect. In exaggerating one or two features, it also simplifies or reduces some others. In visual arts like cartoons, we see faces with huge noses or prominent ears that seem completely disproportionate with the rest of the features. Caricatures are often treated as insulting to the person being caricatured. Politicians are particular favorites for this kind of satire. Ideas are also caricatured. In Pope's The Rape of the Lock, the section on Belinda's makeup process towards the end of Canto 1 caricatures the elaborate vanities, hairstyle, jewelry, clothes, etc. Pope converts the routine act of dressing into something mystic, exaggerating the ritualistic and nearly religious fervor of selecting the right makeup. Each silver vase in mystic order laid, first robed in white, the nymph intent adores, with head uncovered the cosmetic powers. The tortoise here and elephant unite, transformed to combs the speckled and the white. Here files of pins extend their shining rows, puffs, powders, patches, Bibles, billet-doux. Note the exaggeration here. The nymph worships the makeup kit as though it possessed cosmic powers. Then Pope says the tortoise and the elephant unite in the form of combs. Great animals have been reduced to mere makeup equipment in Pope's caricature. The arrangement of pins, powders and puffs are in shining rows. Then he says, now awful beauty puts on all its arms. Suddenly the makeup and dressing acquires a martial touch, arms. The beauty is armed, says Pope. The caricature connects with the poem's larger theme of class tensions and social hypocrisies. Pope suggests that dressing up for a party is akin to dressing up for war, since the social gathering is full of dangerous conversation, uncertain alliances and enmity. Caricature here is directed at the upper class obsession with appearance, the exaggeration of objects and the attitudes towards them as though they are religiously important, conveys Pope's satire about the culture of appearance, which in the poem is shallow and superficial. Pope's caricature is satiric because it ridicules a social convention. Likewise, Dickens's Hard Times makes Thomas Gradgrind a caricature of school teachers. Excessively concerned with facts and seeking mathematical precision of all things, Gradgrind lacks any likable feature. Dickens exaggerates the school system's emphasis on order and rationality. You are never to fancy, declares Gradgrind. The caricature becomes obvious to us readers when Gradgrind objects to carpets with floral patterns because people would place tables and chairs upon them and have people walking over them with heavy boots. Irony is a form of satire where the text seems to say one thing, but on examination reveals a deeper layer of meaning. Two dominant forms of irony occur in literature, especially poetry. Verbal irony is where the words seem to say one thing, but convey something else. In situational irony, there occurs a disparity between what seems to be taking place and what is really happening. What is really happening, say in the novel or stage, is visible to the audience, but not to the characters themselves. since they are only aware of their immediate settings and experience. Take W. H. Auden's The Unknown Citizen. He mocks totalitarian nations where individual citizens are denied the right to be individuals or possess personalities. Everything, suggests Auden, is determined by the state for them. But instead of attacking the system, Auden describes a model citizen. He is one against whom there was no official complaint. He possessed no odd views. Where there was peace, he was for peace. Where there was war, he went. Everything the citizen does, he does in accordance with the law of the state. He has 5 children because 5 is the right number for a parent of his generation. The climax of the irony lies in the last lines of the poem. Was he free? Was he happy? The question is absurd. Has anything been wrong? We should certainly have heard. Auden seems to be depicting a perfect citizen, but in fact, he is not describing an individual, but a man who fits into the system perfectly. The citizen man has no individuality because he only does what is expected of him. Thus, Auden, with his irony, is depicting an individual without individuality. He is satirizing a form of government or country in which there are only automatons. The unknown in the title is the ultimate satire on civilization. Individuals are not known for their individuality. They are numbers or automatons. In Alexander Pope's The Rape of the Lock, he uses the images of military strategy and war, whereas the actual setting is an upper class party. As readers of the poem, we are conscious of the disparity between the language of war and the actual setting of the party. This is situational irony that Pope uses to satirize the class tensions, hypocrisies and drama that characterizes so-called polite society. What Pope does is to satirize the seriousness with which upper classes take clothes, food and quarrels as though these are warlike situations. With this, he satirizes an entire social order. In Dryden's Mac Flecknoe, he mocks the poet Shadwell. The scene is the dying moments of the poet Mac Flecknoe, and he has to choose his successor. This is what Dryden writes. Nature pleads that he should only rule who most resembles me. Shadwell alone my perfect image bears. Mature in dullness from his tender years, Shadwell alone of all my sons is he who stands confirmed in full stupidity. The rest to some faint meaning make pretence, but Shadwell never deviates into sense. In Dryden's poem Mac Flecknoe, he says that nature has a condition when appointing a successor. He should be exactly like Mac Flecknoe. Then Dryden goes on to describe Shadwell. He is from a very early age mature in dullness. Among all Mac Flecknoe's sons, Shadwell alone is completely stupid, and this is confirmed. Then comes the savage satire of the last lines here. Other sons and poets might, says Mac Flecknoe, occasionally make sense in their writings, but not Shadwell. Shadwell, says Mac Flecknoe, never deviates into sense. He is always on the straight route to stupidity. With this satiric portrait, Dryden not only paints Shadwell as a very mediocre poet, but Mac Flecknoe himself. This is something we might miss. What Dryden tells us is mediocre poets can only be succeeded by mediocre poets. When Mac Flecknoe says his successor should be in his perfect image and finally chooses stupid Shadwell, he portrays himself as stupid too. In this literary satire, Dryden mocks the tradition of poetry, which has become mediocre, and stupid people become poet laureates and acquire ill-deserved fame. Now take Alexander Pope's famous epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot. In the poem, the poet is tired of amateur poets seeking his approval and help. He complains to his friend and Dr. Arbuthnot that he is being pursued relentlessly by people who have neither sense of poetry nor any talent. There is the maudlin poetess, a rhyming peer. Even a clerk takes to poetry, he complains. A clerk foredoomed his father's soul to cross, who pens a stanza when he should engross? Is there who, locked from ink and paper, scrawls with desperate charcoal round his darkened walls? What Pope is satirizing here is again the tradition of poetry and the desperate clamor for recognition by mediocre writers. When pen and paper are denied, they use charcoal and write on walls, he says. They also want him to recommend their work, help them get published. Then he shows how he himself is a superior poet, because poetry came naturally to him. As yet a child, nor yet a fool to fame, I lisped in numbers, for the numbers came. Pope satirizes English poetry that has become an industry. People work hard at writing poetry. Thus, Pope separates people like himself who are natural poets from the others who feel compelled to write poetry even when they have no skill. Satire plays a significant role in the criticism of political systems, beliefs and ideologies. Let us take a few early examples to see how political satire operates. One of the most famous of the early English political satires is Jonathan Swift's essay, A Modest Proposal. The essay builds on the English belief that the Irish people were primitive, dirty and savage. The truth was, the Irish were extremely poor and families often did not have enough food for their children. Using these two as his take-off points, Swift proposes that the Irish can sell their children at the age of 1 to the upper class English people, so that the upper classes can eat them. Swift goes on to list the advantages of this arrangement. It will bring in money for the poor Irish family. It will provide a delicious delicacy for the English upper classes, and the skin of the babies can be used to make clothing. Swift writes all this in the tone of a scientific and social treatise, serious in tone. The essay functions as a political satire only when we recognize that Swift is attacking the English upper class and government policy that neglects the Irish, keeps them poor and then attacks them for being poor. The cannibalism that Swift was supposedly advocating in the essay is in fact a political satire on the exploitation of the poor by the rich. Cannibalism in this satire is merely a symbol of economic and social oppression and exploitation of the Irish by the English. Thus, Swift's political satire is directed at the English economy, social order and social policy. In Orwell's Animal Farm, the Russian socialist communist system is satirized. When the novel opens, the old major offers advice on how the animals should behave when they take over the farm. And remember also that in fighting against man, we must not come to resemble him. Even when you have conquered him, do not adopt his vices. No animal must ever live in a house or sleep in a bed or wear clothes or drink alcohol or smoke tobacco or touch money or engage in trade. All the habits of man are evil, and above all, no animal must ever tyrannize over his own kind, weak or strong, clever or simple. We are all brothers. No animal must ever kill any other animal. All animals are equal. The rest of the novel shows how each of these instructions is carefully rejected and rewritten by the pigs who become tyrants on the farm. The foundational belief in the communist ideology is all persons are equal. In Orwell's novel, this foundational belief is the first subverted. All animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. For readers who know Russian history, this makes immediate sense. Although Russia preached the equality of all humans, those who were members of the government or the party had greater privileges and wealth, and thus were not equal to the rest. Orwell's satire shows how even societies preaching equality are actually hierarchical. There will be workers and slaves and some privileged classes who will exploit them. The pigs in Orwell's novel represent the powerful and exploiting ruling classes. So, satire, as we understand now, is of different kinds, like parody, caricature and irony. Also, satire is used for different purposes, like how Dryden uses it to ridicule his contemporary poets, Pope uses it to ridicule the upper classes, while Auden uses it to satirize a whole civilization. Also, we have examined in detail how political satire works with the example of Orwell's novel. As I said in the beginning of this class, we often use satirical remarks to insult or indirectly laugh at others' follies by saying something, but actually conveying something else indirectly. So, learners, from now on, try and identify examples of satire in everyday conversations, news commentaries, etc. You will begin to understand how this technique works, but literary satire is, however, best enjoyed by reading the authors mentioned in this lesson. So, thank you viewers. See you again in the next lesson.